So some interesting perspectives there on a range of issues associated with the collection, ownership, use and management of data. I'm interested in the comments from each of you at this stage, and I'll start with Michael. I guess you're in the firing line to some degree in being a provider and a holder of that data. Do you think there's an adequate understanding of the issues around ownership and protection of that data? Do you think that's a critical issue at this stage, or do you think people are reasonably comfortable with it?
I guess from the international examples, I'd say they don't know what to do with it. Their terms and privacy policies are written in a way where it's confusing, like was described before. So they all agree that growers should own their information that they're putting into the system, and they're written with that kind of context. But it's just a grey area, and no country I've seen is implementing in a way that sets a good standard for everyone to use yet.
I guess the question to Peter and Paul more generally, we had a lot of discussion yesterday about the element of trust, and that trust in a provider or a service provider is a fairly major component of the adoption of that particular platform or the particular technology. Does that almost drive the discussion to very clear understanding between the provider and the user of what the limits are of the use of that data? We understand that the ownership is a nebulous concept, but the use is obviously the critical issue, and I'm wondering whether the need for trust between the provider and the user is going to drive the parameters that determine how the data can be used.
Look, trust arises in different ways. Our governments are very good at saying, trust us. And sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. I actually think that it all boils down to transparency, clarity, clarity around use and the different ways in which things might be used, control, and appropriate allocation of risk and liability. And then the outcome is different for whether government is a data provider or a data user. I take what might be an overly simple view of government, that I pay taxes like the rest of us do to run government, and government collects data in the course of running government, and that data, in my view, should be a public resource, and we should lessen the barriers for government to release that data to enable businesses and citizens to make uses of that data. So I think the position's quite different for government, and really we should set up the incentives the right way to force the data, frankly, out of government in usable form, and get rid of all of the spurious arguments that are made around privacy. Privacy generally can be managed through de-identification of government data sets. It's usually a refuge for scoundrels in departments to say, can't release that data set because of privacy. The answer is, well, de-identify the data set and then release it. Or that there are liability concerns. Oh, the data's not good enough, people might sue us, they might rely on the data when really it's not good enough to be relied upon. Well, okay, explain what limitations there are as to the reliability of your data and still release it. Don't use that as an excuse to hold on to it. And then you let the private sector experiment and add value to that data. Now, the problem then becomes if you can't have a proper negotiation with the service provider, and this is really what Paul was alluding to about if the service provider is a dominant international provider who really doesn't care as to negotiate their terms and conditions with the farmer, you don't have an engaged discussion, and from that the potential for a fair exchange of value. Then you might have to have competition law step in, or have the industry association, Farm Institute, step in and help the farmers negotiate as a block in order to counter the power of the global provider. But generally, where the service provider is a local entity, it should be possible to exert the negotiating power over that entity to negotiate fair terms for use of data. So I'm a great believer in contract, except where parties are so dominant that you can't have a fair negotiation, and that's sometimes the case with government and often the case with multinational corporations, but generally not the case with Australian service providers.
I absolutely believe in trust, I just don't trust it. That's basically, you need the institutional structures, the everything else, and, so that hopefully you'll never have to rely on them. It's a bit like contract in the bottom drawer. You don't need it, that's great.
We've got a question over here.
Rob Bramley, CSIRO. So Peter just started to allude in his answer to the issue of data quality, and yesterday there was a lot of discussion and advice that we needed to focus on the quality of the data. We were also told that it would be wise if we avoided the hype, and that we also needed some trusted advisors. But of course, unfortunately, the trusted advisors are generally speaking also the sources of the hype. And having been involved in precision ag research for almost 20 years, I can say with some degree of regret that the vast majority of the maps that we were shown yesterday, I have close to zero confidence that they were produced with anything like a methodology that approaches the optimal methodology for interpreting those maps. And there were a couple in particular that I thought were verging on the outrageous in terms of drawing a very long bow in terms of what they purported to display based on the information that underpins them. Now, obviously, in spite of not being a lawyer, I'm not going to say which two those were because I don't want to get sued. But I'm surprised that none of you guys have really focused all that much in your discussions on quality of data, because at some point, quite apart from the issues that have been discussed around ownership and so on, there's surely going to be a large discussion and probably some legal debate about whether or not the data that's being used for various purposes is actually appropriate to those purposes.
Absolutely. So the only thing I'd say is that, as I said before, that data quality can be used as I said before, a refuge for scoundrels. That is, it's often used as an excuse why data sets should not be made available. When you pull apart the issue should be around adequate disclosures as to the limitations of data that is made available. And so if we're going to err one way or the other as to releasing data or holding it back because we're concerned about its quality, I'm firmly in the camp of creating the conditions to get the data out there, but creating the incentive structures the right way so that the party releasing the data can explain its limitations. Now, part of the problem there is that we don't even have standardised language to talk about data quality, and you'll know that from the geospatial area in particular. And what we kind of need is a standard set of language around describing data quality, almost like, you have Creative Commons type licenses with standard terms. You try and get some standard terminology or rating systems, is it 1-star or 5-star quality? So we try and simplify the discussions. Complexity is our enemy in a lot of data applications, and the aim, I generally think, is to cut through it all by making it simple and transparent.
Obviously, in terms of technical precision, it's a really important thing, and you guys are expert on that sort of stuff. But I just want to put a little bit to the other side, which is the degree of precision you need, of course, depends on how critical it is to that particular transaction. And so what we've seen in some areas is a pursuit of precision to a great degree, probably what is beyond is needed if you take into account risk and all that sort of stuff. Just we need precise data. And I'm thinking particularly in the natural resources area and extremely precise data about all sorts of stuff. We've just said, well, is it approximate enough for that decision, and can then you discount for risk, and can you deal with that uncertainty in some other ways? So I think that precision is fantastic. We should be pursuing it, and clearly wrong data is wrong data, and that's not good at all. But we also shouldn't get so completely enmeshed in the idea of precision that we lose sight of what's reasonable for the decisions and what are we trying to do.
Yeah, and a lot of big data applications are around triangulating data sets in reality. So you get more data sets out there. Yes, each of them individually are imprecise, but the overlay creates a new precision. So that's important to bear in mind. And too often parties within their own sector are seeking precision and holding back because of lack of precision, when some triangulation with other data sets would lead to greater precision.
Just from a software development point of view, we've always fallen short of making the decision for the user. Like, you don't give them the answer, you give them the information they need and let them draw the conclusion. Your PA example of those maps, I'm not sure the specifics, but if they're actually telling you to do something, that's probably crossing a line that, from every work I've done, we've never. You stop there. You don't make that decision unless it's coming from someone like the advisor that's helping the grower, who's on the ground and can see more of the issue than you can just from a digital system.
Peter Cook from Acknowledge. It's something I've been looking for in the last couple of days in regards to how do we engage with the citizens and consumers. So we've seen a lot of information about interactive database information collection, but then there's also now, especially in the food area, how do we actually start to collect some of that information in that supply chain? And perhaps more importantly, some of the citizen science we're starting to see. How do we incorporate that, especially you touched on biosecurity and wild pigs and wild dogs, and we're starting to look for the citizen science and contribution to the exercise, and how's that going to impact on some of the legal implications and red tape we have as well?
So I run a program for the invasive animal CRC that is based on citizen-based approaches to managing invasive species. And certainly digital data and digital intelligence is really powerful. So the graphic thing that I put up with the pigs collared, almost every landholder seems to believe that all pigs live in the national parks and come out just to forage on their crops every now and then. The data showed, and this work's ongoing now, that basically in one case it was a classical landholder who had this view of what was going on, and the pigs weren't on his property, and they literally found the pigs every night were basically where they slept was around his property. That was, So I think there's a lot more we can use to use technology as a mechanism for engagement, but we have to be a lot more creative about doing it, giving people stuff which engages them in the process of decision making and thinking about, and then getting them to apply their knowledge to what they think's going on. You can really build some decent collaborations. We've got a long way to go on that, a long way to go.
There's a gentleman there.
Hello, my name's Mark Lucky. I'm from Storyboard, and we develop the software that underpins GRDC's NVT Online. I might paraphrase a little to save time, but Peter, you mentioned about the John Deere contracts that I think run for 30, 40, 50 pages long, and I've had a look and they're very, very confusing to read, but they've made it to Australia, and Australian growers are signing them, if I understand correctly. Michael, you touched on the fact that not many countries seem to be sort of getting the framework right around data or the legalities and so on. And Paul, you said we should prepare early and prepare well. So where's Australian agriculture positioned on all of this with regard to getting the most out of the data and making the most of the data for Australian growers as opposed to maybe others with those other interests or the conflicting interests that we may have. So how do we make the most of this, and how are we positioned to make the most of this for Australian growers?
I'll leave anyone to answer that.
Well, no, actually, I think you should answer that, because you've put out a report which has got, you know... Now, I can't feed you better than that, can I, Mick? I can't do better than that.
We need a diversity of voices.
Look, I think the report sensibly looks at the principles that were developed by the Farm Bureau in the US and the New Zealand principles. I think step one is to state some principles for the farm sector that should govern the way in which data is used. Those principles should also address expectations of government and release of government data sets that might be of use to farmers. And I think we need to start the discussion around data-driven liability and really try and see whether it's a real problem that we need to solve or whether it's a second-order issue. I actually don't know the answer to the question, but I do worry that we are capturing vast amounts of data and if we had the time and the energy and the skills to analyse it, we might find things that might lead to liability, and I really don't want data innovation and service innovation to be held up because of fears of a lawyer's picnic if and when they discover all sorts of correlations in that data which we can't even begin to guess. So I think it is important to start the discussion and think about appropriate ways to limit liability and the way in which data might be used by government authorities such as EPA for litigation as well, and how we control and address that.
Yeah, just in the first recommendation that's included in the report, I think is a sensible starting point. I really think that this is going to require a substantial team effort to work out what are the governance principles that are needed here, and I think that's what I would see as a fundamental challenge that probably needs to be addressed.
I think you're sort of alluding to the concept of a default standard of data that everyone's on the common platform. Like it has been tried before by DAFWA somewhat unsuccessfully, and there's commercial companies trying to enter that space now to create that common platform where everyone's communicating in the same way and storing data in the same way. I think that's definitely the way of the future, and that probably solves a lot of the current issues we're seeing with different aggregations of all sorts of pieces of data and software. So I'm not sure if that's what you're alluding to, but just a thought.
See, I'd strongly disagree with that. But what I think we need is a common language and a common understanding of what the principles should be, but I'm very sceptical of industry-wide solutions through defining common standards or common interfaces. In my experience, I've seen in technology innovation for the last 30 years standards chasing innovation and often getting in the way of innovation. What you do is you look for market power and whether people are using proprietary interfaces as a way of entrenching market power, monopoly power. If they're not doing that, I've got no problem with proprietary systems, and proprietary can be good for creating innovation. So I just counsel the agricultural sector not to jump too quickly to industry-wide platforms and standards before thinking hard about how to stimulate innovation and lowest cost delivery of services.
Okay, we might take a final question at the back there, and then we'll break for lunch.
Yeah, Anthony Clark from New South Wales DPI. In the environmental and land data space, there are literally petabytes of data sitting up in the cloud that are free And it ranges from really mature top stuff to stuff that's pretty much straight off the researcher's desk. So it's all open access. You can go and download it all tomorrow if you want. So it all, there's been a revolution in that space in terms of provision of these government data sets. You call them government data sets. Just sitting there. And it's all been done under the legal framework of the Australian Data Commons. And like I said, I personally think there's been a revolution in data availability, at least at that end, for agriculture. To what extent are you guys familiar with the Australian Data Commons, Open Data Commons, and the multitude of licence agreements and legal frameworks underpinning it? And to what extent is that a model that we can look at in the agricultural space to solve some of these problems?
I think it's a great model. It doesn't deal adequately with data quality issues, and it doesn't deal adequately with creating understanding as to subsequent uses of data, but it's a really good start, and I agree with you. Australia's done reasonably well at open government, but I would just note that we're a long way behind the UK and the US in terms of the range of data that is being released into the public arena. I don't know enough about DPI data in New South Wales, and maybe you guys are the shining knights in this, but certainly I know at the federal level that the data sets coming out of the feds is still much more limited than is being made available in the UK and the US.
Look, I think that open access stuff is good, but I think we need to be a little bit cautious about the value of data versus the value of services associated with data. In my prior life, I was involved with the New South Wales Committee dealing with stuff like the Spatial Data Atlas and all of that sort of work. And at the same time, I was chairman of a software company that had products we were developing, and the imposition of non-proprietariness really stopped some major innovations that we were working on. So, it's horses for courses. There's no one solution is ever going to be perfect in this sort of complex world. We have to do the best with what we've got.